all of the four Gospels don't include the names of the authors, so they're all technically anonymous. But that's not a huge cause for concern, because the authors would have most likely put together their Gospel accounts for the members of their own churches at the time, and the members of the early churches would have known the Gospel accounts well. Today, the reason why we attribute the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew is because of historical documents from early church history. All of the earliest traditions of the church hold that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus who was a former tax collector. There were also a couple of important figures, notably the writings of Papias, bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, around AD 135, and Irenaeus, bishop of Lyons in Gaul, around AD 175. They both agree that Matthew was the writer of the Gospel of Matthew. These guys would have had contact with the apostolic community, and if they were familiar with the apostolic community, then they would have been familiar with the Gospel's origins. There is also no evidence existing today from early church traditions that someone other than Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. There are scholars today that don't think Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew because they believe he borrowed a lot of information from Mark's Gospel. The thing is, though, that Matthew was a disciple of Jesus and Mark wasn't, so Matthew wouldn't have needed Mark's information. When Jesus first calls Matthew to follow him, Matthew is sitting in the tax collector's booth in chapter 9, verse 9 of the book of Matthew. Prior to discipleship, his job was to collect taxes from the people for Herod Antipas. In the book of Matthew, this happens in Capernaum. So it's believed that the tax booth was set up on the Sea of Galilee at Capernaum because Herod also taxed fishermen, so it would make sense at the time. In the book of Matthew, he's referred to as Matthew, but you may have noticed that he's called Levi, the son of Alphaeus, in the Gospel of Mark, and Levi in the Gospel of Luke. Scholars don't know exactly why he's called by two different names, but it's believed that he either had two names from birth or took on a second name after conversion. Since Matthew's occupation was a tax collector, he would have had a fair amount of skill in writing. His accounting skills meant that he was capable of recording a person word for word, such as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is considered to be the greatest sermon ever preached. He was also a Jewish Christian, so this would have helped him to put together how Jesus' life fulfilled Old Testament expectations of the Messiah. The exact date of when Matthew was written is not known, but it's believed it was written somewhere between AD 55 through 56. So what exactly is the Gospel of Matthew? It's the story of Jesus of Nazareth, written by Matthew, one of Jesus' chosen disciples. Matthew witnessed the arrival of the long-awaited Messiah, who brought with him the kingdom of God to earth for Israel and all the nations of the earth. Matthew confirms Jesus as the Messiah by linking him to the Davidic kingdom, and he shows us that Jesus is the fulfilled promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, which is the promise that God would bless all the nations of the earth through him. In his gospel, Matthew talks about how citizens of the kingdom of heaven are to live out their lives here on earth, how traveling disciples are to conduct themselves, parables and warnings from Jesus, the need to forgive others, and how human history will end. Matthew attributes Jesus as the royal descendant of David and frequently refers to Jesus as the Son of David. Matthew does all this and quotes the Old Testament more than any of the other Gospels to show how Jesus fulfilled the prophecies in the Old Testament. Matthew's intended audience were his fellow Jewish brothers and sisters. Most Jews stubbornly refused to accept Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah. Although the Jews, especially Pharisees and Sadducees, studied the Old Testament well for centuries, they were blinded from the truth of who Jesus was because they wanted a Messiah that fulfilled their expectations. They wanted a conquering Messiah king who would liberate Israel from their enemies, namely Rome, and bring forth a kingdom that would rule above all the nations of the earth forever. Jesus rebuked the leaders of Israel at the time because of their hardness of heart. What the leaders of Israel at the time failed to accept was that the Messiah and his kingdom did indeed come and will rule forever and ever, but not in the way that they expected. When we read the Gospel of Matthew, we might shake our heads at the incredulous rejection of Jesus from his own people. We might ask ourselves, how in the world did they not see that Jesus was the Messiah? I mean, it's so obvious, right? But instead of asking ourselves why they were blinded from the truth, why don't we instead ask ourselves, are we also doing the same thing? Do we seek God on our own terms? Do we find certain attributes from him, such as his love, mercy, and grace, acceptable, but reject his wrath, justice, and just anger? Do we seek God only when we need him, and not out of love for him? A God who exists only to serve our best needs isn't the holy God of the Bible. Such a God is an idol. If you're watching my video, I thank you for watching until the end. I would like to encourage you to find a Bible and read it so that you may get to know the true identity of God and how much he loves you. God bless you.